If you asked anyone in our town who my father loved most, they wouldn't hesitate. They'd point to my older brother, Daniel, the firstborn, the golden one, the boy who seemed to walk on floors that turned to marble under his feet. People used to pat my shoulder and tell me kindly that I was lucky to have a role model like him. They meant it as comfort. It stung like poison. My father cultivated that myth with the precision of a gardener who trims every branch that isn't his favorite vine. From my earliest memory, our house revolved around Daniel's orbit. The photos on the mantel, his trophies, his uniforms, his newspaper clippings, lined up like a museum exhibit documenting the rise of a future king. My pictures, crooked class portraits, a science certificate, a drawing I was once proud of, were relegated to the sideboard beside the phone, where the lamp's shadow bent over them until they looked like accidents. I learned the choreography of second place before I learned how to tie my shoes. At the dinner table, my father's voice carried like a marching drum. He didn't ask questions. He issued verdicts. "How'd practice go, son?" he'd say, eyes fixed on Daniel. "Good," my brother would reply casually, but his smile always had that smooth, camera-ready curve. "Good," father echoed, nodding, already turning the moment into prophecy. "Discipline. That's what it takes. One day, you'll be running things." Then his gaze would pass over me like a searchlight that found nothing worth illuminating. If I spoke up about a test score or a project, he didn't even look up from his roast. "That's what school is for," he'd say, fork scraping china. "Keep your head down." The house itself taught me the rules. Daniel's room was a shrine. Polished wood, framed metals, the smell of leather and cologne. My room was fine, normal, books stacked on the floor, a cheap desk. I wasn't neglected, just neutral. Love doesn't always scream its absence. Sometimes it just never calls your name. When I was 9, I won a citywide art contest. The drawing took me weeks, graphite moons floating behind a blackened tree line, a single cabin window lit gold in the dark. I remember walking home holding the certificate in both hands so it wouldn't crease. My mother smiled, gently, apologetically, the way someone smiles when the store is out of your size. "That's nice, honey," she said, then moved aside because my father was coming in, and behind him, Daniel, sweaty and sunlit, holding a silver cup the size of a flower pot. "Regional semi-final MVP," my father boomed. He lifted the trophy high like a priest lifts communion. The certificate in my hands felt suddenly thin, nearly invisible. That night, my father opened a bottle of something amber and old. He gave Daniel the smallest sip, a rite of passage disguised as a joke. I asked if I could taste it. He laughed and told me, "Earn it." I swallowed silence and learned its aftertaste. The town reinforced the parable. At church, the pastor's wife told me my brother had leadership in his bones. The hardware store clerk knocked $1 off my father's bill for the future CEO. Teachers invited Daniel to speak to younger classes about discipline and teamwork. When I volunteered to help with the school newsletter, one teacher patted my arm and said she admired my supportive spirit. Supportive, such a careful word for the person who never gets the microphone. As the years rolled forward, the beat never changed. If Daniel sneezed, my father praised his lungs. If I built something, my father inspected the corners and found a flaw. "He has the shoulders for it," he liked to say of my brother. "He can carry a family, a business, a name." He never said what I had. I gathered pennies of approval where I could find them and hid them in my pockets like contraband. On my 12th birthday, my father took Daniel to the office. "Time you saw the gears," he told him. He didn't invite me. I stood on the porch and watched them drive away in the truck with the company logo on the doors. Haller and Sons, painted in navy script my father had chosen before I was even born. The ampersand felt like a promise I somehow hadn't been included in. A seat reserved with my name misspelled, blurred. When they came back, Daniel described the warehouse as if he'd walked through a cathedral. "They all know Dad," he said, glowing. "Everyone stops when he talks." My father clapped his shoulder. "Respect is earned," he said. "But lineage matters." He didn't look at me when he said it, but I felt it anyway, like a draft under a door you can't wedge shut. I wasn't a miserable child. I found pockets of joy the way a stray finds warm tiles. I loved being out behind the house at dusk when the sky turned the color of peaches gone soft. I loved the old radio in the garage, the one that caught ghost stations after midnight. I loved the rare mornings my mother let me crack eggs and whisk them myself. But every tenderness felt like contraband too, permitted in small doses, never to be mistaken for something I could depend on. And Daniel, he wasn't cruel, not in the pantomime villain way. He was simply fluent in a language he'd been taught since birth: entitlement. If I beat him at anything, cards, a spelling list, a sprint to the mailbox, he laughed like he was humoring a toddler. "Let him have it," he'd say, tossing me a grin, and the phrase slid into my ribs like a splinter. Let him have it, as if victory was a favor you could grant rather than a thing you could earn. One autumn afternoon, I asked my father why our name was on the trucks if only one son counted. I meant it half as a joke. Humor was the only safe blade I had. He didn't laugh. "A name is a banner," he said. "Someone must carry it, not two people dragging it in different directions." Then he added almost gently, "Not everyone is built for weight." I learned that day that love in our house came with prerequisites: height, voice, the geometry of a jawline when you're angry. I learned that usefulness was a currency I couldn't print. The first time I saw my father afraid was the winter he slipped on the ice and sat down too hard, breath knocked out, hands shaking. For 3 seconds, Daniel wasn't in the room. It was only me and the sound of my father's surprise. I reached for him, instinct, not strategy, and he let me hold his arm while he counted his breaths. "Good," he said finally, almost to himself. "Good." It was the smallest scrap, the thinnest ribbon, but I stored it away like a pressed flower. I would take my mercies where I found them. But even that moment folded back into the same story. By spring, he had retold it at least 3 times, each version with Daniel in it. Your brother was there, steady as a post. Until even I began to doubt the memory. That was the other trick of growing up in someone else's shadow. You start to forget the shape of your own outline. On the night Daniel got his driver's license, my father handed him a key to the side door of the office. "In case I need you," he said. The metal gleamed in my brother's palm. I remember thinking how odd it was that a key could make a hand look older. My father saw me watching and mistook my face for envy, which it was. "When you find your lane," he said, "you'll get what you need." The sentence sounded kind. The implication wasn't. In our house, lanes were assigned, not discovered. I tried not to want the things I wasn't meant to touch. That was my strategy for survival: starvation of desire. If I didn't want the house, the business, the name, then I couldn't be disappointed when they weren't offered. Want is a dangerous animal when you have nowhere to keep it. But want has its own weather. It leaks through the roof. Sometimes, very late, I'd walk past my father's office and see the door cracked, a blade of yellow light on the hallway carpet. He'd be inside with a ledger open, pen ticking in the quiet. He wore glasses then, another thing he'd deny in the daylight. In those moments, his face looked different, stripped of its sermon. Older, yes, but also human. Regret lives around the mouth. I could see it perched there like a bird that never learned to migrate. Once he caught me watching. We stared at each other across the carpet. "Go on," he said finally. His voice was softer than it ever was at dinner. "Get your rest." I wanted to ask him the question that hummed in my bones. Am I a son too, or just a witness? I swallowed the question and obeyed. On Sundays, he held court in the living room, explaining the empire to Daniel as if it were a parable and my brother a patient disciple. "Margins are the blood," he'd say. "Reputation is the spine." He enjoyed his sentences. He liked how they sounded when they came back to him from Daniel's mouth. I sat on the rug and pretended to read, learning the liturgy I would never be asked to recite. If this sounds bitter, it is, but not only bitter, it is also precise. The truth can be an instrument if you care for it. I tell it now not to indict a dead man or an adored brother, but to set the stage for what came later. The day the script cracked, the day a sealed envelope whistled through our family like a winter wind. People ask when I first suspected there was another story running under our lives like a second river. It wasn't a single moment, it was a collection of small misfires. A summer barbecue where a stranger shook my father's hand too long and called him by a name he hadn't used since college. A photograph in an old ledger tucked in the back of my father on a pier with a woman none of us recognized, his smile a kind I'd never seen at home. A receipt from a clinic across town buried under invoices, dated the year Daniel was born. None of it proved anything. But in a house where everything was certain, these little uncertainties glowed like coals. Back then, I didn't connect them to a child. I didn't even connect them to a lie. I only understood that the story we'd been fed, firstborn heir, second son supporter, was perhaps less solid than the adults needed it to be, and that maybe, just maybe, my father's insistence on one future was less about belief than about fear. Fear of what? I couldn't have told you. I only knew that some nights, when the house went quiet and the mantel trophies turned to silhouettes, the air felt like a question held too long in the mouth. I grew taller. My voice settled. Nothing else changed. Daniel became an institution. My father became a flag. I became fluent in exits, how to leave a room without scraping the chair, how to move a cup from sink to rack without adding sound to a house that didn't want my noise. The day I left for college, my father shook my hand like a foreman dismissing a decent worker at the end of a shift. "Make yourself useful," he said. It was, in his language, a benediction. He hugged Daniel, 2 pumps on the back, the male embrace that stands in for 100 unspoken things, and slipped him a check I pretended not to see. On the bus, I watched our town shrink into an outline and understood dimly that geography alone wouldn't free me from the choreography I'd learned. Some shadows ride. Still, distance taught me that love needn't be rationed. I found teachers who saw me without squinting. I made friends who didn't know Daniel and never would. I stood in doorways and didn't measure my worth by the furniture I wasn't allowed to sit on. For the first time, want didn't feel like contraband. It felt like oxygen. And yet, every holiday I returned home to the same museum, the same mantle, the same liturgy. Legacy, my father would say, the word heavy as a coin. You build it with your hands. You don't inherit it, you earn it, then you pass it to the one who can carry it. He'd look at Daniel when he said it. Of course he did. But every time, I caught the smallest flicker in his eyes. A flinch, a blink too long. If you didn't live in that house, you'd never see it. I did. Regret perched again. The bird that refuses to migrate. I didn't know then that my father had been living with a secret so carefully folded that it left creases in everything he touched. I didn't know there was a name he kept in his mouth like a swallowed seed, a name he'd written on paper he hid where dust wouldn't betray him. I didn't know that a lawyer, quiet, meticulous, patient, had been instructed to wait until a certain date, a certain service, a certain silence, before unfurling that paper like a flag in a courtroom air-conditioned against grief. All I knew was the math I'd been taught since birth. Firstborn son equals heir. Second son equals audience. Father equals law. But life is not math. It is weather. And weather changes, even in houses that pretend it doesn't. When you grow up in the shadow of a crown, you're told will never be yours. You become an expert at predicting storms. The sky had been strange for years by then, clear but humming. I didn't yet understand what was gathering at the horizon, or what kind of rain it would bring. I only knew the air felt charged, and that even marble floors can crack if the ground beneath them shifts. One day, sooner than any of us imagined, someone would open a sealed envelope, and the air in our house would change forever. A name would be spoken out loud, a story would step into daylight, and all the furniture of our lives would have to be moved to make room for it. But that is later. This is the part where the music is still quiet, where the mantle still glitters, where my father's voice still fills the dining room like law. This is the part where a boy learns how to set his jaw and make himself small enough to survive in a house designed for one son at a time. I didn't know yet that another son existed. I didn't know yet that my father's legacy had a seam he couldn't stitch. I only knew that shadows aren't empty. They're crowded with all the things that don't fit in the light, and I was about to discover just how much didn't fit. By the time I reached my teenage years, the divide between Daniel and me had become more than just a difference in how our father treated us. It was practically a public performance. My father didn't just favor him in private. He built an entire narrative around him in front of anyone who would listen. At community gatherings, people would ask about the business, Haller and Sons, and my father would gesture proudly toward Daniel. "This one's already learning the ropes," he'd say. It wasn't just pride, it was prophecy. The whole town accepted it as fact. Daniel would inherit everything: the company, the house, the name. My father reinforced it so often that even I stopped questioning it. It became the air we breathed. But teenagers notice what children can't. We start to hear the inconsistencies in the stories we've been told. I began to notice things in my father's behavior that I couldn't quite explain. He was rigid, yes, but sometimes he was almost distracted. Like there was a part of him that lived in another room, another life. I remember one evening when Daniel and I came home late from school events. He had football practice. I'd stayed behind to finish a project in the art studio. As we walked in, I saw my father in his study with the door half open. He was holding a letter, not the usual invoices or company documents, but something folded, yellowed with age. His face wasn't stern or proud in that moment. It was vulnerable, almost guilty. When he noticed me standing there, he shoved the letter into a drawer so quickly it nearly caught his fingers. "Don't you knock?" he barked. Daniel laughed, clapping me on the shoulder, and said, "He's probably writing secret love letters to Mom." My father laughed too, but it sounded forced. Later that night, I couldn't stop wondering why a successful man who had everything he ever wanted would look so haunted over a single piece of paper. It wasn't the last time. Over the next few years, I stumbled across small, strange clues. A photograph tucked into a ledger, a younger version of my father, smiling in a way I had never seen him smile, with a woman I didn't recognize. A medical receipt hidden among old business contracts, dated the year Daniel was born, but from a clinic far across town. And sometimes, in arguments, my father would mutter things under his breath that didn't quite add up. Words like, "It has to stay clean," or "not again." At the time, I didn't know what any of it meant. I only knew there was something unsaid lurking in our house, something that didn't fit the story of the proud patriarch and his golden heir. Meanwhile, my own role continued to shrink. Daniel excelled at everything, or at least my father made sure it looked that way. When he brought home a B on a test, my father said, "That's fine, son. Focus on what matters: athletics, leadership." When I brought home an A, my father barely acknowledged it. Once, when I pressed him, he said, "Grades won't build a business. Hands will." By the time I was 15, I'd stopped showing him my report cards. What was the point? The cruelest thing, though, wasn't the lack of praise. It was how Daniel learned to wear our father's approval like a crown, using it against me. He'd call me the spare in private. Sometimes he'd joke about how, when Dad retired, I could work in the warehouse or answer the phones. "Don't worry," he'd say with a smirk. "I'll make sure you've got a job." It was half joking, half serious. But even at that age, I knew jokes like that carried more truth than anyone admitted. Still, I found refuge where I could. In art, in books, in the quiet company of friends who didn't know me as the other Haller son. I discovered that outside our house I could be more than a shadow, but inside those walls, the script remained unshakable. The older we got, the more my father tightened his grip on Daniel. He brought him to board meetings, introduced him to investors, let him sign documents. Meanwhile, he told me to focus on finding something practical, as if my existence was a side project he didn't quite know what to do with. And yet, those little cracks kept showing. Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, I'd see my father sitting in silence with that same yellowed letter, or staring too long at the mysterious photograph. His jaw tight, his hands trembling just slightly, and each time he'd tuck it away before anyone could ask. Back then, I didn't know the truth. I didn't know that buried in those papers was the secret that would one day explode like a landmine beneath all of us. I only knew that something didn't add up. And deep down, I began to sense that Daniel's crown wasn't as secure as everyone believed. By the time I was 17, Daniel's place in the family story was carved into stone. Everyone knew he was the heir to Haller and Sons. My father introduced him at community dinners as my right hand, the one who will carry the name forward, and people clapped politely, never questioning it. I had become so accustomed to silence that I wore it like a uniform. I didn't argue anymore. I didn't expect recognition. I had built my own secret pockets of happiness: art, late-night sketching, the occasional laughter of friends who didn't care what my last name meant. And then the rumor started. It came not from family, not from school, but from the kind of place where truths often slip out. A bar, late at night. I wasn't there, of course. I was underage. But Daniel was. He came home one evening, reeking of alcohol and grinning like he had a joke he couldn't wait to tell. He found me in the kitchen, bent over a sketchbook, and dropped into the chair across from me. "Guess what people are saying about Dad," he slurred, tapping the table with his knuckles. I didn't look up. What? That he's got another kid somewhere. Isn't that hilarious? I froze. Daniel laughed, leaning back in his chair. Some old drunk said he remembers Dad running around with some woman back in the day. Said she had a baby. Can you imagine? Dad, with another family? He laughed again, but it wasn't the carefree laugh of someone who found a joke funny. It was too sharp, too loud, almost as if he was daring me to believe it. I forced a chuckle, even as my stomach clenched. Yeah, hilarious. But I couldn't let it go. The next day, I found myself thinking about that yellowed letter I had once seen in Father's drawer, about the photograph of a woman I didn't know, about the receipts from the clinic, little puzzle pieces that had never fit together, until now. Could it be true? For weeks, I carried the rumor like a stone in my pocket, heavy, silent, always there. I didn't mention it to my mother. She had a way of closing doors on uncomfortable subjects. Whenever things got tense between my father and me, she'd smooth it over with a smile, as if discomfort could be ironed flat. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. My father's occasional distance, his strange mood swings, his obsession with making sure Daniel was perfect, untouchable. Maybe he wasn't just protecting Daniel's reputation. Maybe he was protecting something else, something, or someone, that could shake the whole house of cards. The next crack came a few weeks later, at church of all places. An older man, Mr. Whitman, approached me after the service. He had known my father since they were young. He squinted at me, tilted his head, and said something that made my pulse stop. "You look just like her." I frowned. "Like who?" He blinked, as if realizing he'd said too much. Never mind. Just... Your mother must be proud." He gave me a pat on the shoulder and walked away before I could ask more. But his words stuck to me like glue. You look just like her. Not my mother. Not my father. Her. Who was her? That night, I dreamed of faces I had never seen, women in sepia photographs, children without names. I woke up with sweat on my back and a single, unshakable thought. Maybe the rumor wasn't a rumor at all. I tried to ask Daniel again about what he'd heard, but he brushed me off. Drunk talk. Forget it. He had already convinced himself it wasn't real because for him, it couldn't be. His identity, his entire existence, depended on being the only rightful heir, but I wasn't so sure. One evening, I crept into Father's office when he was out. My hands shook as I opened drawers, flipped through files. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, only that I had to find something. And then, buried beneath contracts and tax returns, I found it. A sealed envelope. Thick, heavy, with my father's handwriting across the front. Not addressed to anyone. Just one word written in his bold, precise script, confidential. I didn't open it. I couldn't. But just holding it in my hands, I knew. Whatever was inside was the truth I had been circling around my whole life, the truth my father had locked away. I slipped the envelope back into place, heart pounding, and shut the drawer. From that night forward, I carried not just suspicion, but certainty. My father was hiding something. And it wasn't just about business or inheritance or favoritism. It was about blood. What I didn't know then was that the sealed envelope I had touched was the very same one the lawyer would one day open at my father's funeral, shattering every lie we had ever been told. But for now, it was just a shadow in a drawer, and I was the only one who knew where it was. Once I saw that sealed envelope in my father's drawer, nothing felt the same. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I passed his office door, I felt it calling to me, as if the paper inside had a heartbeat. The temptation to open it was unbearable, but fear kept me from doing it. Fear of what I'd find, fear of being caught, fear that the truth would be worse than the lies I already lived under. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that I was paranoid, desperate to believe there was more to my story than being the overlooked son. But then small moments kept piling up, confirming my unease. One night at dinner, my father was unusually quiet. Daniel was going on about football recruitment letters, his voice booming with confidence. My mother smiled politely, offering encouragement. I sat silent, pushing peas around my plate. Suddenly my father snapped. "Enough about football!" he barked, slamming his fork down. The table shook. Daniel froze, shocked. My mother's face tightened, and I just sat there staring, because this wasn't normal. My father never dismissed Daniel, never cut him off. If anything, he encouraged his every word. But now his jaw was clenched, his eyes distant, as if Daniel's voice had triggered something buried too deep to control. "Dad," Daniel said hesitantly, "did I say something wrong?" For a second, I swear I saw guilt flash across my father's face, but just as quickly, it was gone. He cleared his throat, forced a smile, and muttered, "No, just tired. Eat your dinner." The room fell silent. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. It hit me like a cold wave. Maybe Daniel's golden status wasn't as unshakable as we all thought. Maybe my father's anger wasn't about Daniel at all. Maybe it was about the weight of something he was hiding. The cracks widened in other ways, too. At school, I overheard whispers. A friend's older brother, who worked part-time at a gas station, told me he once saw my father with a woman late at night. Not my mother. He swore they weren't just talking. "You sure?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Positive," he said with a smirk. Guy had his arm around her. Looked intimate. I wanted to dismiss it as gossip, but deep down, I couldn't. The photograph I'd seen, the receipt, the letter, the rumor at the bar, they were all threads of the same fabric. And now that fabric was starting to unravel. The hardest part was how it changed things between me and Daniel. He still carried himself like the chosen son, still teased me about being the spare, but I started to see fear in him too. Subtle, almost invisible. A quick glance at father when his temper flared. A defensive tone when anyone questioned his decisions. It was as if Daniel sensed, without admitting it, that the pedestal he stood on wasn't as solid as he believed. One afternoon, I decided to test him. "Do you ever wonder," I asked casually, "if Dad hides things from us?" Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "Like, secrets. Stuff he doesn't tell the family." He scoffed, but it sounded forced. "Dad?" "No way. He's the most straightforward guy I know." I studied his face. He didn't believe what he was saying. He wanted to, but he didn't. Meanwhile, my mother remained the quietest piece of the puzzle. She never asked questions, never challenged father. She walked on eggshells so softly you almost didn't notice, but I noticed. She had to have seen the signs, too. She had to have known something. One night, after the house had gone quiet, I found her sitting alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea. I sat down across from her, my voice trembling. "Mom," I whispered, "is there something you're not telling me?" "About Dad?" She looked startled, then quickly shook her head. "No, of course not." Why would you ask that? Because sometimes he acts strange, and people talk. They say things. Her hand tightened on her cup. For a moment, I thought she might finally tell me the truth, but then she smiled that same sad smile she always wore when things got uncomfortable. People always talk. Don't let gossip poison you. Your father has worked hard for this family. That's all that matters, but I didn't believe her. Not anymore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth was like smoke. It seeped into every corner of the house, even if no one admitted it was there. I became obsessed with the sealed envelope. I'd sneak into the office just to touch the drawer it was hidden in like it was some kind of relic. I couldn't open it, not yet, but I knew it was waiting. And in my bones, I knew one day it would be opened, whether I wanted it to or not. What I didn't know then was that my father had already made arrangements. That envelope wasn't just a secret. It was a bomb, timed to detonate after his death. For now, all I could do was wait and wonder. The summer before I turned 18, I began working part-time at the company warehouse. It wasn't my choice. It was my father's decree. Every man in this family learns the business, he said, pressing a steel-cold gaze into me. Even you. It's the only way to build discipline. It wasn't glamorous. Long hours, stacking lumber, carrying steel beams, and filing endless receipts in the cramped back office. Sweat clung to me, and the ink smudged on my fingers. Daniel, of course, was paraded around in boardrooms, shaking hands with managers and clients. I was left to sweat and count nails. But sometimes, the shadows are where you find what others try to hide. One afternoon, while filing invoices, I noticed a folder slipped between purchase orders. It wasn't labeled like the others. The handwriting on the tab was rushed, unlike my father's usual neat script. I opened it, expecting to see misplaced receipts. Instead, I found a birth certificate. At first, I didn't understand. The paper was worn, folded, like it had been carried around once too often. The mother's name was unfamiliar, Anna Whitfield. My father's name was listed as the father, and below, in black ink, was the name of the child, Elias Whitfield, born 3 years after Daniel. My hands shook so hard I nearly dropped the folder. The room seemed to tilt sideways. I read it again, then again, as if repetition would change the words, but they stayed the same, clear, unforgiving. I slammed the folder shut and shoved it back into the cabinet, heart hammering. My entire body buzzed as though electricity had run through me. I couldn't breathe. I had spent my whole life being told I was second best, that Daniel was the heir, that I didn't matter. And now, here was undeniable proof that there was someone else. Someone my father had hidden. A half-brother none of us had been told about. That night I couldn't eat. I sat at the dinner table, picking at my food, staring at my father as if he were a stranger. He didn't notice. He was too busy praising Daniel for how he handled himself with the investors. Daniel basked in the glow. My mother smiled softly, the same way she always did. And I sat there with the name Elias echoing in my skull like a church bell. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Dad," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Who's Elias?" The fork in his hand stopped midair. For a moment, the room froze. My mother looked at me sharply, eyes wide. Daniel frowned in confusion. My father's face, usually carved in stone, flickered with something I had never seen before. Fear. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. I swallowed hard. I saw it on a paper. At the warehouse. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's jaw tightened. His hand trembled once before he set his fork down deliberately. "You had no right going through things that don't concern you," he said, his tone like ice. "It does concern me," I shot back, my chest pounding. "He's your son." "Isn't he?" Daniel's chair scraped as he leaned forward. "What are you talking about?" His voice was incredulous, almost angry. "Dad? What's he talking about?" My father's eyes burned into mine. For a moment, I thought he might deny it, might call me a liar, but instead, he did something worse. He said nothing. That silence was confirmation enough. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. This is insane. Tell him he's wrong. Tell him there's no other. Enough! My father roared, his voice shaking the walls. My mother flinched, her hand flying to her mouth. The room went dead quiet. No more of this, he growled. What's in the past stays there. Do you understand? But I didn't understand. Not anymore. I stood, my chair screeching against the floor. You lied to us, I whispered, my voice trembling with rage. All this time. You made me feel like I wasn't enough, like Daniel was the only one who mattered. And the whole time, you had another son. My father's eyes hardened. Sit down, he ordered. But I didn't. I walked out of the room, my mother calling my name, Daniel cursing under his breath, my father's silence like a hammer behind me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying everything. The photograph, the receipt, the letter, the rumor, and now, Elias. It all made sense. My father's obsession with Daniel wasn't just favoritism. It was desperation. He needed Daniel to be perfect, untouchable, unchallenged, because there was someone else out there, someone who could ruin everything. And I realized then that my father's empire, the family name, the inheritance, none of it was as solid as it seemed. It was a fragile structure, held together by lies. I didn't know where Elias was. I didn't know if he even knew who we were. But I knew one thing: someday, the truth would come out. And when it did, nothing in our family would survive untouched. The morning after I confronted my father at dinner, the house was silent. Too silent. Usually Daniel would be blasting music upstairs, my mother would be humming in the kitchen, and my father would already be barking instructions into the phone. But that morning, no one spoke. No one looked at me. At breakfast, my mother set down a plate of toast in front of me without a word. Daniel glared from across the table, his jaw tight, his face pale with rage. My father didn't even come downstairs. It was as if my question had detonated a bomb, and everyone was still choking on the smoke. When I couldn't stand the silence any longer, I spoke. So that's it? We're just going to pretend nothing happened? Daniel's chair screeched as he shoved it back. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped. You think you found something, but you're just twisting it. Dad would never... He didn't deny it, I interrupted. My voice was low, but the weight of it landed like a stone. You saw his face. You heard his silence. He didn't deny it because it's true. Daniel's fists clenched. Shut up. I leaned forward. There's another son, Daniel. And you're terrified of what that means. He slammed his palm onto the table so hard the dishes rattled. Shut up, he roared before storming out of the kitchen. My mother's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. Don't tear this family apart. I stared at her in disbelief. Me? I'm not the one who kept a second life hidden. That was him. That was Dad. She shook her head, as if I was a child who didn't understand. You don't know the whole story. Then tell me, I begged. Please, tell me who Elias is. Tell me why Dad... But she pressed her lips together, refusing. Her silence was worse than denial. For days afterward, the atmosphere in the house was suffocating. My father avoided me entirely, leaving early, coming home late. Daniel barely looked at me, and when he did, it was with venom. My mother tried to act as if nothing had changed, but her hands trembled when she poured tea, and I noticed she cried when she thought no one was watching. But the secret had already poisoned us. Daniel grew restless, snapping at everyone. His confidence, once unshakable, began to crack. I overheard him arguing with my father late one night. Their voices echoed down the hall, muffled but sharp. You told me I was the heir, Daniel shouted. You promised everything would be mine, and now he's digging up... Enough, my father cut him off, his tone cold. What's in the past doesn't change your future. But if it gets out? Daniel's voice broke, high with panic. If there's another, then you deal with it, my father growled. Like a man. I crept back to my room before they could hear me. My heart pounded. Daniel wasn't just angry, he was scared. For the first time, I saw the golden boy stripped of his shine. At school, I carried the secret like a ghost at my side. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but how could I? Who would believe me? My father was a pillar of the community, a self-made man with a flawless reputation. To accuse him of fathering another child would sound like spite, the bitter lie of the overlooked son. So I kept it inside, but the weight of it pressed down harder every day. Then something happened that I will never forget. I was in the warehouse again, filing paperwork, when one of the older employees, a man named Carl, who had worked for my father for decades, pulled me aside. His eyes were tired, his voice hushed. "You're not crazy," he said. I froze. "What?" He glanced around to make sure we were alone. "I heard you and your brother arguing the other day. About Elias." My stomach lurched. You know about him?" Carl nodded slowly. "Everyone who's been around long enough knows. Your father did his best to bury it, but secrets don't stay buried forever. There was another woman, another son." He hesitated, then added, "Your father paid to keep it quiet." "But money doesn't erase blood." I stared at him, speechless. The rumor wasn't just a rumor, it was real. And now someone else had said it out loud. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally. Carl's expression softened. "Because I've seen what it's done to you. To all of you. You deserve to know the truth, and you deserve to be ready, because one day that truth is going to come crashing down, and nothing will be the same." That night, I lay awake thinking of Elias. Was he alive? Did he know about us? Did he wonder why his father had abandoned him? Or worse, did he know and hate us for living the life he was denied? And most of all, I wondered why my father had chosen silence over honesty. Why he would rather let his family rot from the inside than speak the truth. I didn't know it then, but the answer was already written, waiting inside that sealed envelope. The will, the final detonator. And when the day came that it was read aloud, everything, our inheritance, our identities, our loyalties, would explode. By the time autumn arrived, the air in our house was no longer thick just with silence. It was heavy with dread. My father had grown older almost overnight. His shoulders, once squared like a soldier's, slumped under an invisible weight. His hair, once just streaked with gray, looked fully silver in the harsh morning light. Even his voice, which used to boom through the halls like a command, now rasped with fatigue. He wasn't dying, not yet, but mortality clung to him like a shadow. And with every cough, every moment he rubbed his chest when he thought no one was looking, I felt the ticking of a clock we had all been pretending didn't exist. Daniel noticed it too, though he would never admit it. He walked through the house with his chin higher than ever, barking orders at the staff, lecturing me about responsibility, as if he'd inherited our father's authority early. But beneath the performance, I saw it, the cracks. Once, at dinner, father corrected him. Just a small thing, a detail about an upcoming business deal. Daniel's face went red. He snapped back defensively, something he'd never dared to do before. "You can't expect me to know everything," he muttered. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. My father stared at him, disappointment simmering, and for the first time in my life, Daniel looked small. Not the golden heir, not the flawless firstborn, just a man fumbling to hold on to a crown that suddenly felt too heavy. At night, I heard him pacing in his room. Sometimes he muttered to himself. Other times I heard the thud of his fists against the wall, muffled curses following. Once, I even caught him in the garage, gripping one of father's old ledgers so tightly that the paper crinkled. His eyes were wild, desperate, as if the numbers on the page might vanish if he didn't memorize them. "Daniel?" I asked cautiously. He looked up, startled. For a moment, he wasn't my confident brother. He was a boy again, cornered. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. "I could ask you the same," I said. His lips twisted. making sure what's mine stays mine. What do you mean? But he didn't answer. He shoved the ledger back onto the shelf and stormed past me. The truth was eating at him. I could see it every time the name Elias hovered unspoken in the air. Father had forbidden us from ever mentioning it again, but silence doesn't erase suspicion. It feeds it. Daniel was unraveling because he understood something I hadn't yet put into words. The existence of another son didn't just complicate things, it threatened everything. If Elias was acknowledged, Daniel's entire identity, the heir, the favorite, the chosen, could collapse. My mother, meanwhile, became a ghost in her own home. She moved through rooms like a shadow, avoiding confrontation at all costs. When Daniel shouted, she retreated. When Father grew cold, she disappeared into the garden. And when I tried to press her, to make her speak, she would only shake her head and whisper, "Not now. Please. Not now." But if not now, when? One evening, I found myself standing outside Father's office. The door was closed, but voices leaked through. His and Daniel's. "You have to tell me what's in it," Daniel said, his tone sharp with panic. "No," Father replied flatly. "You'll hear it when the time comes. You can't leave me in the dark. If there's some—" "Enough." My father's voice cut like steel. "The will is written. Nothing you say will change it. The will." My heart pounded. I leaned closer, my breath shallow. Daniel's voice cracked. "If you leave that lawyer with power over everything—" I said enough. Father's tone lowered, final, immovable. The sound of a chair scraping, heavy footsteps. I barely had time to retreat before the door flew open and Daniel stormed out, his face red, his eyes burning. He didn't see me in the shadows, but I saw him. And for the first time in my life, my brother looked not just angry, but terrified. That night, I couldn't sleep. The word will circled in my mind like a vulture. I thought about the envelope in Father's drawer, the one marked confidential. I thought about the way he had snapped at Daniel, the way his silence had confirmed more than denial ever could, and I realized something chilling. Whatever truth my father was hiding, whatever legacy he had been protecting with lies and silence, it wasn't just about me. It wasn't even just about Elias. It was about everything. The business, the house, the inheritance. And when the day came that the lawyer read those words aloud, it wouldn't just expose a secret, it would destroy the crown my brother had worn his whole life, and maybe, just maybe, it would finally set me free. Winter came early that year, the kind of winter where the air feels sharp enough to cut skin, where the sun hides behind clouds for weeks at a time. And inside our house, the cold seemed to seep deeper than the walls could contain. My father began coughing more often. At first, he brushed it off as nothing, just the season. But I watched him clutch the edge of a table when he thought no one was looking, his knuckles white, his breath uneven. The man who once seemed invincible was shrinking before my eyes, and it terrified me in a way I didn't want to admit. Daniel, on the other hand, doubled down on the performance. He hovered constantly, insisting on driving Father to meetings, standing by his side like a guard. He wasn't helping out of love. He was protecting what he believed was his birthright. The worse Father's health grew, the more desperate Daniel became, as if he thought he could muscle his way into securing his place before it was too late. But Father's patience for him was wearing thin. One evening, I passed by the study and heard Daniel pleading, "At least tell me what the lawyer knows." "I can't go into this blind." Father's voice was low but sharp. "It's not for you to control." "What if he—" Daniel's voice cracked. "What if he says something that ruins everything?" "He will say what I instructed him to say. That's all you need to know." The door slammed shut, and Daniel stormed past me without a word. The lawyer's presence, even unseen, began to haunt the house. His name, Mr. Aldridge, was spoken in fragments, whispers. My father met with him in secret, always behind closed doors, always without Daniel. I caught glimpses of their meetings through windows, two figures hunched over papers, shadows stretching long across the desk. It didn't escape my notice that my father never invited Daniel to those meetings. For all his boasting about the family business, Daniel was left outside, and the more he realized it, the more restless he became. One night, I found him in the garage again, pacing like a caged animal. "He's cutting me out," Daniel muttered, almost to himself. "He's giving that lawyer more power than me." "It's not right. It's not fair," I hesitated. "Maybe there's more to the story than you know." His eyes snapped to me, wild and furious. "Shut up. Don't you dare," but he knew. Deep down, he knew. My mother grew quieter with every passing week. She sat at the dinner table with her hands folded, her eyes downcast, as if she were already mourning something none of us dared to name. Sometimes I caught her staring at father with a look that wasn't quite love, wasn't quite anger, just resignation. As if she had known all along that this day would come, and she had been bracing for it in silence. And me? I lived with the constant awareness of the envelope. I knew where it was. I knew what it meant. Sometimes, when the house was empty, I'd creep into father's office and open the drawer just to touch it. I never opened it. I didn't have to. The weight of it told me everything. It was the center of gravity in our lives, the silent anchor dragging us all toward the inevitable. I started dreaming about it. Dreams where the envelope burst into flames. Dreams where Elias walked through the door holding it in his hands. Dreams where Daniel ripped it open and screamed as the words bled into the walls. I'd wake up sweating, my chest tight, knowing only one thing. The lawyer was coming. The will would be read. And when that happened, the house we had lived in all our lives would never be the same again. One snowy afternoon, father collapsed in his study. I found him slumped over the desk, his hand clutching his chest, his face pale as ash. For one terrifying moment, I thought he was gone, but he gasped, eyes fluttering open, and whispered, "Call Aldridge." Not a doctor, not my mother, not Daniel, the lawyer. I dialed the number with shaking hands, and within an hour, Mr. Aldridge was at our door. He was a tall man, thin, his gray coat dusted with snow. His presence filled the room in a way that made my stomach twist. He didn't greet us like an old friend. He greeted us like someone who already knew he was about to change our lives. He went into the study, closed the door behind him, and stayed with father for nearly 2 hours. None of us were invited inside. When he finally emerged, he nodded politely at my mother, gave me the faintest look of recognition, and walked past Daniel without so much as a glance. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides, his face turned scarlet, and I knew, in that moment, that he felt the crown slipping. From then on, everything was different. Father rarely left his study. Mr. Aldridge came more often. Daniel became more frantic, pacing the house like he was standing guard over a kingdom he could no longer defend. And I began to understand that when the end came, it wouldn't be just grief that tore us apart. It would be the truth sealed inside that envelope, waiting to be read aloud by the lawyer who held all the power. It happened faster than any of us were ready for. One morning, I awoke to the sound of my mother's sobs echoing down the hall. By the time I stumbled to the study, my father was already gone. He lay slumped back in his chair, his face still, his hand resting on the desk where the ink of his last signature hadn't yet dried. A pen lay fallen at his side, the nib bleeding into the wood. Daniel arrived seconds later, and his voice tore through the room. "No! No, this isn't—" He grabbed father's shoulders, shaking him as if sheer force could drag breath back into his chest. My mother pulled Daniel away, clinging to him, her cries muffled against his shirt. I stood in the doorway, unable to move. Part of me expected him to sit up, to bark an order, to tell us we were wasting time. But the silence was absolute. For the first time in my life, my father could not command the room. The days that followed blurred together. Neighbors brought food we couldn't eat. Old colleagues visited with stiff handshakes and rehearsed condolences. The town mourned the loss of a great man, a pillar, a legend. But inside the house, grief was a battlefield. Daniel walked with his chest puffed out, as if wearing invisible armor. He greeted mourners with his firm handshake, saying, "Thank you. I'll make sure his legacy continues." It was as if he were already stepping into the role of patriarch. But I noticed the twitch in his jaw, the restless tapping of his fingers, the way his eyes darted whenever the lawyer's name was mentioned. He was trying to wear confidence like a cloak, but fear leaked through the seams. My mother moved like a ghost, quiet and hollow-eyed, her hands trembling whenever she touched father's things. She wouldn't meet my gaze for long. Maybe she feared what I might ask, or what she might finally be forced to answer. And me, I carried a secret that burned hotter with every passing hour. I knew the truth wasn't buried with my father. It was waiting, sealed inside the will, ready to rise like smoke from the grave. The funeral itself was a spectacle. The church overflowed with people, business partners, employees, neighbors. Everyone came to pay tribute to the man who had built an empire with his bare hands. His casket, draped in flowers, sat at the front like an altar. Daniel sat tall, stone-faced, accepting condolences like a king awaiting his coronation. My mother wept silently beside him. I sat on the edge, watching the faces in the crowd. And then, for a brief second, I saw someone I didn't recognize. A young man standing at the back, his face pale, his eyes locked on the casket, with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. He didn't look like a mourner. He looked like someone watching a play he had been excluded from his whole life. When our eyes met, he disappeared into the crowd. I don't know if it was my imagination, or if I had just seen the ghost of Elias. After the burial, after the condolences, after the last mourner had left, the house grew quiet. Too quiet. We sat in the living room, the three of us, staring at nothing, and then the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Mr. Aldridge stood there in his gray coat, holding a leather case under his arm. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of finality. "Shall we begin?" he asked. Daniel's head snapped up. "Begin what?" he demanded, though his voice already knew the answer. "The reading of the will," Aldridge said simply. The words dropped like stones into the room. My mother's breath hitched. Daniel's face flushed with both fury and fear, and my heart pounded because I knew this was it, the moment everything would be torn open. We followed him into Father's study, where the air still carried the faint scent of ink and tobacco. The leather case clicked open, papers shuffled. The envelope, that envelope, was laid gently on the desk. Aldridge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read. The room felt like a tomb. The curtains were drawn, the lamps lit dimly, dust catching in the beams of light like tiny ghosts. My father's chair sat empty at the head of the desk, but somehow his presence lingered, thick and suffocating. Mr. Aldridge laid the sealed envelope flat on the desk. For a moment, no one breathed. Then he broke the wax seal with a deliberate snap, the sound echoing like thunder. Daniel leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. My mother stared down at her folded hands, lips pressed so tightly together they'd gone pale. I sat rigid, my heart pounding, every nerve in my body alive with dread and anticipation. Aldridge's voice was calm, measured, as he began. "This is the last will and testament of Henry Haller." The words droned on at first, the formalities, the dates, the legal language. Daniel shifted impatiently, barely able to contain himself. He was waiting for the confirmation of what he had always believed, that everything, house, business, fortune, would be his. And then Aldridge's tone changed. "To my eldest son, Daniel Haller, I leave..." Daniel's eyes lit up. "A portion of the estate, to be divided in accordance with conditions to be explained." Daniel blinked. "A portion?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "What do you mean, a portion?" Aldridge ignored him and continued. "To my younger son, whose worth I have underestimated but whose resilience has been proven, I leave equal claim to all assets and holdings." I gasped. My mother's head snapped up, tears already pooling in her eyes. Daniel shot to his feet. "Equal!" he shouted. "He doesn't get equal, he's not—" "Sit down," Aldridge said firmly, without looking at him. Daniel's face went scarlet, but he sat, trembling with rage. And then came the words that shattered everything. "And to my son, Elias Whitfield, born of Anna Whitfield, I leave rightful acknowledgement of his bloodline, and a share of inheritance equal to that of his brothers." The room exploded into silence. Not even the sound of breathing, just shock. Daniel's mouth fell open, his face twisted with horror. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, a muffled sob escaping. And I, though I had suspected, though I had found the certificate, though I had seen the cracks forming for years, felt my chest cave in. Hearing it spoken aloud, in my father's voice written across paper, made it undeniable. Elias existed. Elias was real. Elias was one of us. Daniel shot to his feet again, pointing a trembling finger at Aldridge. "This is a lie! It's forged! He wouldn't destroy everything like this." Aldridge looked at him with calm pity. "Your father dictated this will to me himself. Every word. His signature is on these documents. This is his truth." Daniel's face turned purple with rage. He knocked over his chair, pacing the room like a trapped animal. No, I won't accept this. I'm the heir. I'm the firstborn. This bastard doesn't get a piece of it. He doesn't even belong in this family." But the words fell flat. For the first time, Daniel's crown had slipped completely. I sat frozen, my mind reeling. Equal. That single word had rewritten the story of our lives. Equal. Not lesser, not spare, equal. And Elias, whoever he was, wherever he was no longer a shadow. He was flesh and blood, named in ink, tied to us forever. As Aldridge closed the folder, the weight of the silence was unbearable. My mother sobbed softly. Daniel's fury rattled the room, and me. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not victory, not joy, but release. The chains of second place had been broken. My father, in death, had finally admitted the truth he never could in life. He had other sins, other failures, but at least in those final words, he had set down the crown not on one head, but on three. The storm had only begun. There would be lawsuits, fights, wars between us. But the truth was out. The secret was no longer locked in a drawer. Elias was real, and now nothing in our family would ever be the same again.